There's a specific kind of tired that doesn't show up on any medical chart. It's not the tired from working too hard, or staying up too late, or running on bad sleep. It's the tired you feel after a perfectly fine day. A day where nothing went wrong. A day where you did everything you were supposed to do, checked everything off the list, answered every message, and still ended up lying in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like something invisible had been quietly drained out of you. You probably know this feeling. Most people do, even if they've never said it out loud. It's strange, because by almost every measurable standard, life has gotten easier. We have more access, more convenience, more entertainment, more choice than any generation before us. Food arrives at the door. Entertainment arrives at the tap of a screen. Friendships, or something resembling them, arrive through a feed that never stops scrolling. And yet, somehow, fulfillment, the actual feeling of being satisfied, settled, present in your own life, seems to be getting harder to find, not easier. Maybe that's the part nobody really talks about. We tend to assume fulfillment is something we'll arrive at eventually, like a destination. Get the job, get the apartment, get the relationship stable, get the bank account looking a little less terrifying. And somewhere past all of that, fulfillment will just be waiting for us, quietly, patiently, like it's been there the whole time. But for a lot of people, that moment never quite arrives, or it arrives and disappears almost immediately, replaced by the next thing to chase. There's a version of this that plays out almost identically for millions of people, just with different details. You wake up already a little behind. The phone is checked before your eyes are fully open, not because you're expecting anything important, but because some part of you has been trained to need that first hit of information just to feel like the day has started. Messages, notifications, a headline you didn't ask for. You're not even awake yet and your nervous system has already absorbed 40 new pieces of information. By the time you're at work, or opening your laptop, or starting whatever version of productive your day requires, you're already running on a kind of low-grade alertness that never fully turns off. Not panic, just static. A background hum of stimulation that doesn't let your mind settle into anything for very long. And this is where modern life becomes strange, if you actually stop to look at it. We've built an entire existence around constant input, constant choice, constant comparison. And we did it so gradually that most people never noticed the moment it stopped feeling optional and started feeling necessary. Think about how often you reach for your phone not because you need something, but because the stillness feels uncomfortable. That gap between tasks, between conversations, between thoughts, it used to be where boredom lived. And boredom, as unpleasant as it sounds, used to be where reflection happened. Now that gap gets filled almost instantly. A scroll, a glance, a notification. The moment never gets the chance to just exist on its own. Maybe that's part of the problem. There's a quiet kind of psychological exhaustion that comes from never letting your mind finish a thought before another one interrupts it. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like burnout in the traditional sense. It feels more like fragmentation, like your attention has been sliced into smaller and smaller pieces, until even rest doesn't feel restful anymore, because some part of you is still half expecting the next interruption. And underneath all of that fragmented attention, there's something else happening, something a little harder to name. We live in a culture that has quietly tied identity to consumption, not in some dramatic, obvious way, but in small daily decisions that accumulate over time. What you buy, what you wear, what you stream, what you order for dinner when you're too tired to cook and too lonely to eat in silence without something playing in the background. Each of these choices feels small and personal, but together they form something larger. A sense that who we are is constantly being expressed, performed, and updated through what we consume. The uncomfortable part is this: when identity becomes tied to consumption, fulfillment becomes tied to it too. And consumption, by design, never actually satisfies for very long. That's not an accident. That's the entire model. The apps are not built to make you feel complete. They're built to make you feel almost complete, just enough to keep returning. The products are not designed to make you feel finished. They're designed to make you feel like the next version, the next purchase, the next update will be the one that finally closes the gap. So you keep moving, keep clicking, keep buying, keep scrolling, not because you're undisciplined or weak-willed, but because you're interacting with systems specifically engineered by people who study human psychology for a living, whose entire job is to understand exactly what keeps your attention from settling. That sounds dramatic, It isn't, really. It's just business. But the emotional cost of that business model is something we're only beginning to quietly understand. And maybe that's what makes modern life feel so emotionally confusing sometimes. You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're responding, in a very human way, to an environment specifically designed to keep you wanting, rather than satisfied. There's a particular moment a lot of people experience without ever naming it properly. It usually happens late at night, somewhere between scrolling and sleep, when you open your banking app for no real reason. You're not checking anything specific. You already know roughly what's there, but you look anyway, almost like checking it wound to see if it still hurts. And it does. Not in a catastrophic way. Just in that quiet, low-grade way where the number on the screen doesn't match the effort you've been putting in, and some part of you starts doing math it never agreed to do. Rent against income. Subscriptions against necessity. That purchase from 3 weeks ago against whatever logic seemed to justify it at the time. This is where modern financial life intersects with modern emotional life in a way that rarely gets discussed honestly. Because money, for most people, was never really about money. It became a stand-in for safety, for self-worth, for proof that the effort being put in somewhere is actually adding up to something. And when the numbers don't reflect that effort, it doesn't just feel like a financial problem. It feels personal, like evidence of failure, even when the failure isn't really yours. Even when wages have stagnated against a cost of living that keeps quietly climbing. Even when the entire economic structure around you has shifted in ways that make stability harder to reach than it was for the generation before. But the emotional brain doesn't always do macroeconomics. It just feels the gap, and assumes the gap means something is wrong with you specifically. So people adapt, quietly, almost without noticing. Some adapt by avoiding the numbers altogether, letting notifications pile up unread, letting that anxious feeling sit unexamined because looking directly at it feels worse than not looking at all. Others adapt by spending in small emotional bursts. Not large, reckless purchases, just frequent small ones. A coffee that costs more than it should. A subscription that gets renewed without thought. A late-night order that arrives less because you're hungry and more because the act of ordering itself produces a tiny, temporary relief. At first, it feels completely harmless. A small treat, a little reward for getting through another long day. But slowly, something changes. The treats stop feeling like treats and start feeling like maintenance. Like the only available tool for managing an exhaustion that never really gets addressed at its source. This is emotional spending, though it rarely gets labeled that way in the moment. It isn't about the object being purchased. It's about the brief window of relief that comes right before the purchase. That small dopamine lift of anticipation, the feeling of doing something, choosing something, controlling something, in a life that can often feel like it's controlling you instead. And the strange part is how quickly people adapt to it. The relief gets shorter each time. The next purchase needs to be slightly bigger, slightly more frequent, just to produce the same emotional effect. Not because anyone is irresponsible, because the brain, like any system, builds tolerance. Underneath all of this sits something even quieter. Comparison. Not the dramatic, obvious kind, but the ambient kind that lives inside a feed you didn't even consciously choose to absorb. Someone's vacation, someone's renovated kitchen, someone's announcement that feels, for reasons you can't quite explain, like it says something about where you should be by now. Most people never notice this shift happening, but it happens almost constantly. A feed designed to show curated highlights becomes, without anyone intending it, a quiet measuring stick. And measuring sticks, when used often enough, start to feel like truth. You're not failing. You're being compared against a version of life that was never fully real to begin with. A version edited, filtered, and selected specifically because it performs well. Not because it's representative of anyone's actual daily experience. But knowing that intellectually doesn't always stop it from landing emotionally. This is where status anxiety quietly enters the picture, even for people who would never describe themselves as materialistic. It isn't always about wanting luxury. Sometimes it's simpler than that. It's about wanting to feel like you're keeping pace. Like you're not falling behind some invisible standard that everyone else seems to be meeting without effort. The pressure doesn't disappear. It just changes form. It moves from explicit, like keeping up with a neighbor's car, into something more diffuse, more constant, more difficult to name, because it's no longer one neighbor. It's potentially everyone you've ever followed, all visible at once, all curated, all updating in real time. And somewhere inside that constant low hum of comparison, fulfillment becomes even harder to access. Because fulfillment requires presence. It requires being where you actually are, with what you actually have, long enough to notice that it might be enough. Comparison does the opposite. It pulls attention constantly outward, toward what isn't yours, toward what hasn't happened, toward some imagined version of a life running parallel to your own. Maybe that's part of what makes contentment feel almost unfamiliar now. Not because people don't want it, because the architecture of daily life rarely gives attention the chance to rest somewhere long enough to feel it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness at all from the outside. It looks like a packed calendar, a phone full of contacts, a feed full of interaction, comments, reactions, little red notification bubbles suggesting connection is happening constantly. And yet, underneath all of that activity, a lot of people quietly admit, usually only to themselves, that they don't feel particularly close to anyone. This is one of those uncomfortable truths that's easier to feel than to say out loud, because admitting it sounds almost ungrateful. You have people in your life. You have conversations. You have a group chat that's technically active. So how could you possibly be lonely? But connection and contact aren't the same thing. Even though modern life often treats them as interchangeable. A message exchanged in passing, a like left on a photo, a quick reaction to someone's story. These things create the texture of connection without always creating the substance of it. They're frictionless, which is exactly what makes them so easy to maintain and so easy to mistake for closeness. Real connection, the kind that actually nourishes something, tends to require time, attention, vulnerability, and a kind of sustained presence that doesn't fit neatly into a notification. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more frictionless contact becomes, the less practice people get at the harder, slower work that real closeness actually requires. Sitting with someone in silence without needing to fill it. Having a difficult conversation without the option to simply close the app and disappear. Tolerating the discomfort of being truly seen, rather than the safer, more curated version of being seen that a profile allows. At first, this trade feels completely reasonable. Easier contact, less effort, more reach, but slowly, something shifts. The muscles required for deeper connection get used less often, and like any muscle, they start to atrophy quietly, without anyone noticing the loss until they actually need it. This is where modern loneliness becomes strange, because it doesn't always announce itself as absence. It often announces itself as exhaustion. People come home from a day full of messages, calls, meetings, and interactions, and still feel an ache that none of it actually touched. Not because the people around them don't care, because most of the day's contact never asked anything real of anyone involved. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy hiding inside convenience. The very tools built to keep everyone connected have, almost accidentally, made certain kinds of connection feel unnecessary, even inconvenient. Why have a difficult conversation in person when a text avoids the discomfort? Why sit with someone through an awkward silence when a phone offers an easy exit? Why risk vulnerability when performance is so much safer? None of this happened because people stopped caring about each other. It happened because the path of least resistance was built, quite intentionally, to be the path most people would choose. And over time, the path most chosen becomes the path most normal, until eventually it stops looking like a choice at all. This same pattern shows up somewhere else too. Inside the strange, quiet guilt that surrounds rest, there's a particular kind of person, and there are a lot of them, who cannot simply sit and do nothing without some part of their mind quietly accusing them of wasting time. Rest, real rest, the kind without a screen, without multitasking, without some productive justification attached to it, has started to feel almost foreign, even uncomfortable. This is productivity guilt, and it rarely gets discussed as the emotional issue it actually is. It gets framed instead as a discipline problem, a time management problem, something to be optimized away with another app, another system, another color-coded calendar. But underneath it sits something much more human, the quiet belief that worth has to be earned constantly, through output, through visible effort, through some form of productivity that can be measured and displayed. The strange part is how this belief rarely gets directly taught. Nobody sits a child down and explains that rest must be justified. It accumulates instead, through years of subtle reinforcement, the praise that came easier after achievement, the quiet tension that filled a house during periods of stillness, the cultural noise constantly suggesting that everyone else is doing more, building more, becoming more. And so rest becomes complicated, not relaxing, exactly, more like an interruption that has to be tolerated and quickly justified, often by attaching some kind of self-improvement narrative to it. The walk becomes a podcast. The bath becomes a chance to plan tomorrow. The quiet moment becomes filled, almost reflexively, with something that at least feels productive enough to earn permission to exist. At least not immediately does anyone notice how exhausting this constant low-level striving actually is. It just starts feeling normal. It becomes the baseline, and once exhaustion becomes the baseline, fulfillment becomes even harder to recognize, because there's no contrast left to notice it against. If these conversations help you slow down and think a little differently about modern life, you're welcome to stay around. Some people come here looking for answers. I think most of us are just trying to understand ourselves a little better. So where does that leave us? With all of this, the fragmented attention, the quiet financial pressure, the comparison that never really turns off, the loneliness disguised as constant contact, the guilt that follows rest like a shadow, where does fulfillment actually fit into a life built this way? Maybe the honest answer is that fulfillment was never going to arrive the way we were taught to expect it. Not as a destination, not as some final state reached after enough achievement, enough income, enough recognition. Maybe fulfillment was never meant to be a finish line at all. There's a quieter possibility here, one that doesn't get much attention because it isn't dramatic enough to sell anything. Maybe fulfillment isn't something added on top of life once everything else is finally arranged correctly. Maybe it's something that was already available in the ordinary moments, the ones that get skipped over because they don't feel significant enough to notice. The walk to the train where nothing eventful happens. The quiet 10 minutes with a coffee before the day demands anything. A conversation with someone who isn't trying to sell you anything, isn't performing anything, isn't checking their phone halfway through what you're saying. These moments were never absent. They were just constantly being interrupted, overshadowed, or rushed past in favor of something that felt more urgent, even when it wasn't actually more important. This isn't a call to abandon modern life entirely, to delete every app and disappear into some idealized simplicity that doesn't actually exist for most people. That kind of solution sounds appealing in theory and tends to collapse quickly in practice, mostly because modern life isn't optional for most of us. Work still requires connectivity. Relationships still happen partly through screens. The world isn't going to slow down just because one person decides they want it to. But something smaller, something quieter, does seem to make a difference. Noticing. Just noticing, without immediately trying to fix or optimize or monetize the noticing itself. Noticing the moment your hand reaches for your phone out of discomfort rather than need. Noticing the small purchase that's really an attempt to soothe something that has nothing to do with the object itself. Noticing the comparison creeping in while scrolling, and recognizing it for what it actually is. A curated performance, not a measuring stick for your own life. Noticing the guilt that shows up the second you try to rest, and gently questioning where that guilt actually came from in the first place. None of this requires a complete transformation. It doesn't require quitting your job, moving to the countryside, or becoming a different person entirely. It just requires a slightly different relationship with attention itself. Treating it as something valuable enough to protect, rather than something to be constantly handed over to whatever app, feed, or notification asks for it first. There's something comforting about finally noticing the pressure instead of constantly running from it. Not because noticing immediately solves anything. It doesn't. The economic pressures are still real. The algorithms are still designed exactly the way they're designed. The culture of comparison isn't going to dismantle itself because one person decided to log off for an evening. But noticing changes the relationship to all of it. It moves a person from being unconsciously shaped by these forces to being consciously aware of them. Which is a small shift, but not a small thing. Awareness doesn't remove the water everyone is swimming in. It just means you stop mistaking the water for the air. Maybe that's enough for tonight. Not a solution, not a 5-step plan, not a transformation promised by the end of the video. Just a slightly clearer way of seeing why the exhaustion exists in the first place. Why the comparison feels so persistent. Why rest feels complicated. Why connection sometimes feels thinner than it should, even when it's constant. Maybe fulfillment was never missing. Maybe it's just been quietly buried under all the noise, waiting in the ordinary moments that get skipped because they don't announce themselves loudly enough to compete with everything else demanding attention. Maybe modern life feels lighter once we stop pretending we're unaffected by it. Once we admit, even quietly, even just to ourselves, that the tiredness is real, that the pressure is real, that the loneliness inside constant connection is real. And maybe, somewhere in that honesty, fulfillment stops being something to chase and starts being something to simply notice. Already there, quietly waiting, in whatever ordinary moment happens next.